The year was 1927. The cliffs of Muscat stood tall and silent, etched with the names of European ships that had come and gone. But few had dared to undertake the journey Bertram Thomas was about to embark on. Without modern transport or communications, Thomas and his companions would travel nearly 300 miles along the northern Omani coast, over its remote interior mountains, and through its desolate deserts to reach the Persian Gulf coast. Bertram Thomas, explorer, diplomat, and writer, is remembered for being the first European to cross the Empty Quarter, one of the most barren deserts on Earth. He had a detailed knowledge of the region's people and language, thanks to his service to the British government in Iraq and Jordan during and after World War I. In 1925, Thomas was stationed in Oman as finance minister to Sultan Taimur bin Faisal. The Sultan, a close ally of the British, relied on Thomas to stabilize the country's economy, while Thomas seized the opportunity to deepen his knowledge of Oman and its varied landscapes. As Bertram Thomas set out on his journey from Muscat, he was accompanied by Sayyid Said, the heir apparent. Their boat voyage provided an escape from the rocky embrace of Muscat's harbor, where the city's long-standing connection to foreign visitors was evident.
As we rounded the bold western arm of the harbour, we saw the name Diana in fresh white 6-foot letters beside a beautifully painted Trika lure recording the recent visit to the Sultan of a French sloop of war. Thus must every ship leave her card in Muscat, hence the first thing to strike the visitor on entering the cove is that all about him the cliffs are emblazoned with ships' names.
After an hour of sailing along the Omani coast, the small bay of Saih al-Mali came into view. The green water shimmered under the sun as Thomas and his companions made landfall, their journey just beginning. Awaiting him on the shore was an old companion.
My faithful Kuwara, besides a dozen other camels, was there, Kuwara whose hump had already known me for 1,000 miles. But alas, I must shed her of her new glory, for the gay trappings with which she was caparisoned were scarcely suitable for the workaday world.
As Thomas prepared for the journey inland, Sayyid Said, the young heir, restlessly handled his new rifle, eager to test it against the desert wildlife. But as they moved deeper into the land, it was not game but water that consumed their thoughts. In the desolate landscape of Wataya, every man's mind was fixed on the most precious resource.
Water is the fount of life. We have made of water everything living, says the Quran, and with the pastoral inhabitants of thirsty Arabia, it is the supreme consideration. Ask a man what manner of country such and such is, and he will surely reply in terms of its water.
As their caravan pressed forward, one of their Bedouin companions suddenly halted and pointed toward a distant depression. The man believed the spot was the key to sweet water. His confidence in the power of timing and tradition, however, met with skepticism from his companions. But his faith in the mystical forces he believed governed the land remained unshaken.
That is the place to dig for water, said Saif bin Yarab suddenly, by way of a general challenge. Dig there on a Wednesday, he returned dogmatically. Let the hour be 4 o'clock. How many of Saif's Badu companions subscribed to his beliefs in a propitious day and hour for striking sweet water I cannot say, but the Bedouin are a superstitious race.
As Thomas neared Wataya, the green groves and small white house that once belonged to a former sultan came into view. It was here that the Sultan of Muscat awaited their arrival. The scene was both ceremonial and intimate, as a line of 50 armed men in white robes approached, chanting in unison. At the head of the procession stood the Sultan, a dignified figure, ready to offer the customary Arab welcome.
At 30 yards we couched our camels to dismount and approach on foot the country's ruler, who also advanced to receive us. Such is the ceremonious yet simple welcome of the Arab.
After initial greetings, Thomas and the Sultan made their way to the Burza, a traditional assembly where tribal leaders, their men, and honored guests gather. Coffee, dates, and incense were passed around as the group settled into the essential ritual. For the Bedouins, the frequency of the coffee cup defined the worth of their leader's hospitality. Yet, for Thomas, the Burza also meant physical discomfort. The seated position of the Bedouins, a relaxed posture honed through years of desert life, was far from comfortable for the stiff Englishman.
For me, I confess it was 10 minutes of extreme discomfort, because long and intractable European legs were never meant for the sitting position, not to mention the rising and resuming with every new arrival. My legs sometimes rebelled with pins and needles, or temporary lifelessness, against this tyranny of the half-sitting, half-kneeling posture in which the Badu spends a large part of his day.
As Thomas settled in with the Sultan and his entourage, the conversations that followed revealed their cultural differences. For the Arabs, marriage was an expectation and a part of life that began early, often arranged by parents. Divorce was common, unburdened by the societal stigma that existed in Europe.
"Why aren't you married, Wazir?" was fired off at me by an uncomprehending Arab as our enforced intimacy broke down barriers. I say uncomprehending because almost all Arabs of this class marry, or rather are married by their parents, on reaching the age of puberty. They can divorce at will without incurring penalties for bigamy. All this without affecting their reputation or the current of their lives.
As he explained the challenges of being an unmarried Christian serving in the East, the conversation took on a light-hearted tone. The Sultan, aware of Thomas's longing for adventure, offered to help him marry the vast and untamed Rub al-Khali Desert. As midday approached, the group came together for the midday meal. Thomas's companions strapped on their dagger belts, an essential part of attire for any public or semi-public occasion. The meal itself was a grand affair, with a vast array of dishes spread before them. At its heart was hariz, a rich paste of shredded meat, flour, and fat, crowned with melted butter, a favorite among the Bedouins. The meal continued in silence, as was the custom, without the usual pleasantries exchanged over food. In fact, customary greetings were deemed inappropriate in the context of dining. Instead, a light-hearted exchange marked the arrival of a late guest.
Over food, the otherwise invariable salutation of Salam alaikum, peace be upon you, is not observed, nor is handshaking permissible. Ka innahum, as they are, says the latecomer, wa anta minhum, and you are of them, is the response by way of welcome.
In a moment of instinct, Thomas's left hand reached forward, only to be withdrawn quickly, as the rules of the table were strict. Eating with the left hand was a strict taboo.
As the meal goes on, the European legs are getting cramped. A white left hand, which might be strapped to my side for all the good it is, suddenly lunges forward, only to be drawn back, abashed. On such an occasion, the meaty titbit that clings tenaciously to the bone and is the cause of the lapse is about to be abandoned, when a merciful neighbor, I always had the good fortune to sit next the host, stretches forth his right hand to hold the bone while the morsel is removed.
With a chorus of voices proclaiming Allahu Akbar, the profession of faith rang out across the desert as the caravan prepared to depart. 50 voices began the call, answered by 100 more in perfect harmony. This takbir, an expression of devotion, marked the signal for the group to mount their camels and begin their journey. For Bertram Thomas, the sight of the mounted Bedouins, moving as one, was awe-inspiring.
Few spectacles are more moving than a large body of mounted men in the silent parts of the earth, and as I, the only European of their number, stood upright in my stirrups and looked back over the column, filing past the little mosque on the edge of the palm grove, I decided that we made a brave picture.
As the caravan advanced through the barren landscape, more Bedouins joined from the flanks, halting in their tribal groups to await the Sultan's arrival. Though their salutation was one of verbal respect, the Bedouins carried themselves with a natural dignity. The deeply rooted belief in God fostered a sense of equality among the people, even when addressing their ruler.
The poorest freeborn Badu is so obsessed by the absolute omnipotence of God that he considers no man his superior and will speak with the easy freedom that springs from that consciousness.
The journey continued through a bleak and arid valley, the terrain marked by volcanic rock and sand dunes. As they neared their destination of Bawshar, 3 old forts came into view, their crumbling structures still carrying an air of nobility. At one of these forts, a muzzle loading gun fired a shot in honor of the caravan's passage, a ring of blue smoke rising up and lingering in the valley. Arriving in Bawshar, Thomas was greeted by Sheikh Ali, the local representative of the Sultan. Sheikh Ali embodied the grace expected of a man in his position. But in a twist of irony, he was also related to the Sultan's greatest adversary.
Oddly enough, he is the brother of the Sultan's enemy and usurper in interior Oman, the present Ibadhi Imam.
In 1913, a rebellion broke out against the ruling Al Said dynasty, primarily in the interior of the country. The rebellion was led by the Ibadhi population, who sought greater autonomy from the coastal rulers. The tension between the coastal regions, which were under the control of the Sultan, and the interior, dominated by the Ibadhi population, culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Seeb in 1920. This treaty effectively divided Oman into two spheres of influence. The coast, including Muscat, remained under the control of the Sultanate, while the interior came under the rule of an autonomous Ibadhi imamate. Sheikh Ali's hospitality was impeccable, and for the first time, Thomas was granted the luxury of a room to himself. Despite his dislike for communal sleeping arrangements, Thomas found himself reflecting on the character that defined his Bedouin companions.
Though I dislike herding arrangements, I must confess that where discomfort is unavoidable, the finicky European has much to learn from the cheerfulness and complacence of his darker and fatalistic brethren in Arabia.
The next day, Thomas was drawn to the famed hot springs of Bawshar and Gala, whose waters had once lured sultans across vast distances to bask in their rejuvenating effects.
This water is full of minerals, particularly of sulfur, and its reputation for health-giving properties in the days of old brought more than one Sultan of Zanzibar 2,000 miles across the sea to enjoy it.
Even in this serene setting, local superstitions were evident. As he followed the stream to its source, Thomas discovered an offering left by a local to appease the spirits thought to reside there.
A spot where the stream comes oozing hot out of the side of the mountain is held to be possessed of a devil, and in sickness or adversity, evidence of a devil that must be propitiated. I came upon a curious commentary on this one day when, as I followed the stream up to its source, I saw on a rock a little freewill offering of a tiny basket of dates and some raw eggs.
As Thomas and his companions continued their journey, they crossed into one of the most important regions of Oman, the Baatinah. This long coastal plain stretches between the mountains and the Gulf of Oman, forming a fertile crescent that has sustained life for centuries. For Thomas, traveling through this province offered a unique view of Oman's natural beauty and its bustling local life.
A uniform threefold nature characterizes the Baatinah throughout its great length. First, a stretch of shining sandy beach, very gently shelving and almost everywhere innocent of rocks. Secondly, a mighty palm grove, one of the three largest in the world, which marches with the beach continuously for 150 miles, in places 2 or 3 miles deep. And thirdly, a great wilderness of shingle plain that stretches back from the palm grove to the mountains, a plain often skirted with acacia jungle where it meets the palm, and elsewhere largely covered with camel scrub.
The group's path took them through fishing villages linked to the legends of Sinbad the Sailor, and small ports where pearl divers sought their fortunes under the waters of the Persian Gulf. After a pleasant journey, they settled at a peaceful campsite near a small patch of palms. In the late afternoon air, the group relaxed, and the conversation soon turned to one of the most important daily rituals for Muslims, the prayer time. With their watches in disagreement, the Sultan turned to Thomas to resolve the question.
"What is the hour, O Wazir?" I glanced at the watch I kept Arab time by. "Exactly 12 o'clock," I returned vaguely, a remark that was greeted with a shout of laughter, for the sun still shone brightly well above the skyline, and Arabic 12 o'clock is, of course, the moment when the sun's upper limb disappears below the horizon. The Arab system of taking sunset as 12 o'clock, as opposed to ours of deciding that hour by its crossing the meridian, is a most error-promoting and laborious arrangement. It involves regulating one's watch every evening. One might well be on the high seas for the uncertainty of it.
The next morning proceeded smoothly until a sudden Shamal, a fierce north wind, swept through the camp. The wind came without warning, bringing with it a sandstorm, leaving the group enveloped in a blanket of dust. The storm buried saddles as nature once again asserted its dominance over the harsh desert environment.
This was torture to our eyes, noses, and ears. It buried our saddles and completely blotted out the great range of mountains that but a moment before had looked down upon us from a glorious distant prospect nearly 10,000 feet above.
Respite from the sandstorm arrived when Thomas and his companions entered a date grove 2 hours before sunset. The dense greenery of the grove served as a natural barrier, providing shelter from the wind and sand. As they rode beneath the shade of the towering palms, the atmosphere transformed from the barren landscape of the desert to a scene of lush, vibrant life. Emerging into open landscape again, they crossed the wide, pebbly wadi beds, leading them closer to the coastal village of Seeb. A ceremonial greeting awaited them as they approached, with a line of white-robed men firing their rifles in unison, puffs of smoke rising into the air in a gesture of welcome. Seeb came alive in the summer when residents of Muscat would escape the heat of the capital, finding refuge in the cool shade of the groves. The migration was a tradition in which even the poorest wanderer partook.
Seeb is a sort of Brighton of Muscat, into which the population of the capital pours almost en masse in the summer months. There is at this time a migration of the town population of Southeast Arabia to the date groves, and the poorest tinker will wander off for 3 months, without any visible means of supporting himself. He comes along with a straw mat as his only possession and enters a date garden, the owner of which has never seen him before, but recognizes his immemorial right to shade before private ownership in dates had been devised. No one would think of turning him away.
Although no one would be turned away from the shade, there were clear rules regarding rights of landowners and those sleeping in their groves. For Thomas, this practice echoed memories of his childhood in England.
His wants are few, a handful of dates and water from the copious well. He may not, however, take from the trees. That would be theft. It is to the dates that have fallen to the ground that he applies, without question, his prescriptive right, a species of ethics which, as a boy, I applied clandestinely to many a rosy Somerset orchard.
The gardens of Seeb provided an escape for wealthy Omani merchants, who had traveled far and wide, often introducing exotic plants they encountered on their journeys, transforming their gardens into tropical paradises.
It seems always to have been the custom for the Muscat merchant of standing to invest in a Seeb garden. The result has been good, for at least the gardens have not been devoted purely to commercial ends, and their owners, men who have crossed the seas to Iraq, India, or Zanzibar, have introduced plants and flowers they have met on their journeyings.
After a morning walk in the lush garden, Sayed Said and Thomas made their way to the Burza, the daily assembly. The seating was simple, mud benches adorned with carpets and pillows, but the significance of the gathering was much deeper, a meeting of authority and community. During these gatherings, traditions were passed down and stories shared. Thomas was drawn into a conversation with an old sheikh who pointed out a young boy sitting at the assembly, sharing an amusing anecdote about the boy's grandfather who refused to trim his beard.
This unwillingness among tribal Arabs to cut the beard is curious. Whether or not it is to facilitate matters on the day of resurrection, as some say, I do not know. Certainly the nails are pared without misgivings. Among their women, too, they never burn their shed hair, and if they do not bury it, one may come upon bunched tufts protruding from the clefts of ancient garden walls.
Soon after, a Banian, an Indian merchant, came to petition the Sultan. The Banyans were vital in facilitating trade between Oman and regions like Iraq, India, and East Africa, known for their sharp business acumen. This particular Banian had a grievance to raise, but the hour was late, and the Burza had already stretched on. The Sultan, eager to move on to breakfast, directed the merchant to present his case to Thomas.
The administration of these tiny townships are very primitive, patriarchal in fact. The wali, or governor, who dispenses a summary justice, assisted by a qadi, or judge of holy law, and some dozen soldiers are its framework. and the petition of the Banyan, the only one of this sect in the place, shed a curious light on the rude but time-honored police system.
The case brought forward by the Banyan shed light on the governance in small towns like Seeb. The night watchmen, members of the Bani Ruwaiha tribe, were responsible for the safety of property during the night. However, the Hararis, as these watchmen were called, were also held accountable for thefts. If a crime occurred under their watch, they would be required to compensate the victim. This system, unique to the remote corners of the Middle East, was not without its flaws, as the Banyan's story revealed. Months earlier, his shop had been burgled during the night, and the chief of the Hararis had informed him of the crime. Distraught, the Banyan had immediately sought the Wali's help, though his response was disappointing.
The Wali, the Banyan, and the chief scallywag then formed a trio of investigators and went to the scene of the burglary. They found the shop rifled. The Wali was inclined to take the long view of Allah's everlasting mercy, but otherwise was not conspicuously helpful.
Despite the Wali's indifference, a local kafar, a sand tracker with a reputation for extraordinary skill, was called upon. Without the modern technology of fingerprinting, the people of the desert relied on their own unique systems. The kafar, revered for his ability to identify individuals based solely on their footprints in the sand, soon confirmed the thieves' identity.
The Kafar of Seeb declared that the thieves were none other than the night watchmen themselves, who all three were thereupon sent to Jalali Fort at Muscat, and there, in the absence of a local habeas corpus, still linger.
As their journey continued, the echoes of Allahu Akbar, God is great, rang out from the newly mounted Bedouins. Each tribal group rode proudly in front of the Sultan, pausing to offer a salute with the sweep of a cane in his direction. Their journey led them from lush date groves into acacia jungle, where the date palms gradually thinned out. The thorny acacia branches were a vital resource for the local economy, used by Oman's diverse communities.
Overhead thorny branches, which here and there make one bend in the saddle to avoid them, are to the Bedouin perfect camel fodder and to the Banyan and Lawati merchant a source of wealth when cut and exported as firewood to Bahrain, Dubai, and southern Persia.
The Lawatis, much like the Banians, were a distinct merchant community in Oman. While the Banians were Hindu merchants hailing from India, the Lawatis were a Shia Muslim community with origins in Sindh, Pakistan. Both groups played crucial roles in Oman's trade networks, connecting the Sultanate with markets in India, Persia, and beyond. As they passed occasional deserted mud forts, Thomas's companion pointed out a unique feature of the Ibadhi mosques that dotted the landscape. In Oman, the Ibadhi sect, a branch of Islam that is neither Sunni nor Shia, had its own set of customs. The simplicity of their mosques reflected the puritanical nature of Ibadhism, which eschewed grand decoration.
The Ibadhi mosque is unique in having no minaret to speak of, and where it has fallen into disuse, it would be sacrilegious to remove such of its interior fittings, doors, and furnishings as have survived the hand of time, even though they might be wanted for a new mosque.
Ibadhism, which dominates religious life in Oman, bears similarities to Wahhabism in its austere approach. While outwardly plain and unadorned, the Ibadhists believe their mosques are spiritually grand, with holiness reaching beyond what the eye can see, as one of Thomas's companions remarked.
You see that mosque squat and lowly, but we are taught that screened from our eyes, there continues up from its foundations a mighty pillar of holiness through the seven heavens.
At last, they arrived at Wadi Manumah, a tranquil valley marked by its towering half-tree. The clean, sparkling bed of the wadi and the plumed palms surrounding it offered an ideal camping ground for the night, a peaceful end to their journey through the acacia-covered plains. As Thomas and his companions set out the next morning, the ground was littered with treacherous blind holes, hidden beneath the surface, and soon enough, two of the Bedouins were tossed headlong from their camels as the animals stumbled. But these minor incidents were quickly overshadowed by something more dangerous. A sudden commotion drew Thomas's attention to the right, where an old Bedouin stood dismounted, shouting frantically.
The camel had lifted the old man bodily off his feet and held him suspended in the air, while neighboring Bedouins slithered down from their own camels and struck with their canes at the brute's head. The latter, relaxing his hold, the Badou fell in a crumpled heap to the ground, his hand bleeding profusely and arm hanging limp.
It was a terrifying display of the power of these desert animals. As the Bedouins rushed to beat the frothing beast into submission, the camel bellowed and extended its red tongue, a wild fury in its eyes. Despite their efforts, the old man, now bleeding and injured, begged them to stop. The camel was his, and he had no desire to see it further harmed. Once the animal finally released him, he shakily climbed back onto its back, and the caravan resumed its journey. After the terrifying event that morning, Thomas's party was concerned for the elderly Bedouin who had been bitten. Upon setting up camp, they sent for the man to assess his condition. He arrived with his injured arm raised, showing 2 deep tooth-mark contusions on his wrist, the red raw flesh visible through the torn skin.
The old man worked his fingers, and with confidence born of hope, perhaps, declared that no bones were broken. Min Allah, God's will, he said fatalistically, and went off uncomplaining to his village.
Thomas next arrived at Barqa Fort, a once imposing structure that had seen better days. The fort was crumbling with age, much like the old cannons that lay scattered around it. Yet, despite its current state, Barqa Fort held an important place in Oman's history.
The natural center of the Baatinah province, it was Barqa that excited the covetous eyes of Saud, the Najdian invader, who sent thither his Wahhabi hordes at the beginning of the last century. And here to this very fortress, Sayyid, the greatest sultan the country ever knew, came as a boy. Hither he lured and slew his uncle, the regent and pretender, and thus succeeded to the throne. And now for a century the place had the tradition of being administered by some exalted member of the ruling family.
The group had made their way to the fort, along the beach, with their camels' feet splashing in the surf, and the Bedouins shouting war cries into the sea breeze. Off the shore, 2 dhows added to the sense of a bygone era, like ships straight out of an Elizabethan or medieval port. After dismounting, they settled into sablas, large huts made from palm branches that provided shelter and comfort. Thomas reflected on how these open, ventilated huts were superior to tents, particularly in their protection against the harsh sun. The group had planned for an early departure that afternoon, aiming to reach Musana'a by sunset. Everything was set for their journey when, at the last moment, a horseman appeared, galloping up with a sheaf of telegrams in hand. The responsibility of translating the messages fell to Thomas, and as he read through the cables, his furrowed brow caught the attention of the Sultan.
What's the matter? What has happened?
The news was grave. A serious situation had erupted in Gwadar, a small enclave in modern-day Pakistan, which prior to 1958 was ruled by Muscat. Gwadar was facing an outbreak of sectarian violence. One person had been killed, others injured, and fear gripped the town. Immediate assistance was requested.
Gwadar on the Makran coast was the scene of a disturbance. The substance of the cables was that a Sunni mosque had been desecrated with human filth. The Baluchis, to whom the mosque belonged, suspecting the Lawati, had retaliated on the meeting house of the latter. A riot was reported to have ensued. 1 man had been killed and others injured.
The Sultan, visibly disturbed, waited for Thomas to finish. This was a significant departure from the usual peace in Oman's territories, where religious sects, including the Ibadhis, Sunnis, Shias, Ismailis, Hindus, and others, generally coexisted harmoniously. Now the sectarian violence in Gwadar threatened to destabilize the Sultan's dominions. The implications were serious. Should they cancel their tour and deal with the crisis? Perhaps Thomas himself should go to Gwadar to oversee the situation. But logistical challenges complicated the decision. The state gunboat was undergoing repairs in Bombay, and the mail boat that could reach the Makran coast only made fortnightly stops.
We cogitated and finally sent orders to state representatives in Muscat and Makran, and a reassuring message to the Aga Khan's council at Karachi.
In the end, they chose to delay any drastic decisions until more information could be gathered. The group decided to halt for the night, waiting for further developments before making a definitive move. As the sun rose on Barqa, new telegrams arrived, dispelling lingering doubts. The situation was under control. The group set off in the afternoon riding northward along the coast. Their destination, the pink island of Suwadi. As they approached Suwadi, a small gravel mound caught their eye, adorned with fluttering red and white rags. A fisherman's shrine. The sight of it sparked a sharp debate among the group, particularly from an older Bedouin who viewed it with disdain. For him, this humble shrine, dedicated to a local holy man, was a betrayal of the pure monotheism of their Ibadhi faith. The coastal trek continued along the shining strand, where flamingos, crabs, and seabirds moved in harmony with the landscape. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, the blue-green waters of the sea began to fade, and the sails of the fishing boats, bright in the afternoon sun, turned from pink to black as night began to fall. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of a flashing gun, welcoming them to the old town of Musana'a. The next morning brought the arrival of 3 Awamir tribesmen, who knelt before the Sultan in a display of submission. The Awamir, known for their fierce and unruly nature, had come to pay homage. Their reputation as raiders was well known.
On hearing of the ruler's arrival, every tribesman from far and wide, it was immaterial whether they were his subjects or not, came to pay homage and enjoy the royal bounty as a matter of right. Now of all tribes, the Bedou Awamir, whose roamings lie beyond the Sultan's borders, have, by general consensus of opinion, the ugliest reputation. They are held to be desperate raiders, who neither pray nor fast, and by the Hadar of Oman, often their victims, their room is preferred to their company.
Their journey continued through the plains of Oman, where Thomas reflected on the social structure and the way of life for the people of the region. The Bedou, proud and pure in their own eyes, lived a simple existence, disdainful of those who worked the land or fished the sea.
Man may live in 3 ways. He is fisherman, or date cultivator, or shepherd. The last named is poorest and proudest. To him, agriculture is a mean occupation, sailoring or fishing unspeakable lowness, wherefore it is vain for the follower of such avocations, rich though he be, to aspire to the hand of the Bedou's daughter.
The coastal regions of Oman are home to people whose lives revolve around the sea and the date palm groves. Though many of the fishermen here are more recent arrivals from the Makran coast, they are still bound to the ancient practice of harvesting the rich bounty of the sea.
Their chief prey is that somewhat incongruous pair, sharks and sardines, the shark for its fins and tail, which command a price beyond that of prime English beefsteak in the China market.
While sharks are prized for their valuable fins, destined for distant markets, sardines serve a humbler purpose. Much of the catch is exported to India, where it plays a role in agricultural production, while some remains in Oman, used as both food and fertilizer. Moving inland, a different way of life unfolds, one centered around the date palm groves of the Baatinah coast.
These unending palms of the Baatinah must be numbered in several millions, and it is the surplus of their produce, sent overseas, that brings back to these shores rice, coffee, sugar and spices from India and East Africa, and the piece goods of Manchester and of Japan.
Each year, as summer approaches, peaceful rhythm of life in Oman transforms into a hive of activity. 2 great migrations occur, drawing people from distant lands to the sea and the groves.
Now is the pearl diving season, when men stream northwards to the pearl banks on the Trucial coast 100 miles distant. Fishermen and sailors go actually to dive, and they who hoist and lower them into the depths may be gardeners or even occasional Bedouins, who have joined the pearl fleet for this season of feverish activity.
While the men sail north in search of pearls, women from across the region make their way to the Baatinah's lush groves, to oversee the harvest in their men's absence.
An army of women, veiled and well-dressed in black and gold cloaks, now journeys southwards to the Baatinah by the returning caravans, to sojourn while their men are absent on the pearl banks. 3 months hence, this process will be reversed, indicating that date and pearl harvests have been gathered.
Arriving in the town of Suwaiq, Thomas finds himself immersed in the traditions of the Bedouin. A highlight of any arrival is the camel race, a time-honored way for new arrivals to showcase their skill and the strength of their mounts.
To gallop a camel is no easy feat, and to the natural disabilities of her ridiculous cowhocks and ungainly size, her own unwillingness must be added. But it is almost de rigueur amongst Bedouin for the new arrival to show the villagers who have turned out to welcome him the mettle of his mount and his own riding prowess.
After the race, the day's gathering begins with the Sultan holding an audience. Among those who approach him is an elderly man, once a notorious slave dealer. The subject of his grievance centers on the inheritance of a slave. The Sultan listens, though the conversation soon veers into the complexities of Islamic law and the fine distinctions between sects.
"What is the ruling of thy holy law on this matter? What sect art thou?" asked the Sultan. "For this may have some subtle bearing. Baluchis in their own country are generally of the Hanafi persuasion, but not infrequently adopt Shafi tenets when domiciled in Oman, and Sharia law, as between the sects of Islam, sometimes has slightly conflicting bearings."
Suwaiq, and indeed much of this region, has long been tied to the darker aspects of human trade. Its location made it a natural hub for the trafficking of slaves, bringing young boys from the coast of Pakistan to be sold across what is today the UAE.
This Yal Sa'ad wedge of country in the middle Baatinah has always been notorious for its slave-dealing activities. It has profited by its position opposite the Makran, a happy hunting ground for young slaves for the Trucial coast, and it has in consequence naturally rebelled against the Muscat connection, whereby it is brought under the British treaties of 1845 and 1873 for the suppression of the slave trade.
Yet, as Thomas reflects, slavery in this part of the world did not always carry the same brutal connotations as in the West. Slaves, while bound to their masters, were often treated as extensions of the household, taking on roles of responsibility and even rising to positions of power.
Without in any way attempting to justify so inhuman an institution, one may be allowed to point out that the domestic slavery of Arabia is not the slavery which makes the blood of the 20th century humanitarian run cold. There are no whips and scorpions about it. It has little in common with the unpitying harshness of our own industrial revolution or the slavery of the sugar plantation. Slavery in Arabia is almost wholly domestic slavery. I do not speak of the pearl fisheries. The slave is the household servant, the court scullion, the tribal coffee maker, his master's bodyguard. He receives no wages as such, it is true, and therefore is spared the horror of wondering where next weeks are coming from.
Remarkably, some slaves, through their abilities, had climbed the social ladder, even achieving positions of power and influence that would be unthinkable elsewhere.
But the slave, with the Arab, is by no means a class without rights. If he has ability, his master will advance him to the highest position, will reward and manumit him. Bin Saud, I seem to remember, at the time I served in Transjordan, sent a slave as governor to neighboring Joff.
Thomas recalled a previous visit to the Grand Fort of Hazm, just a few miles away, near the ancient capital of Rustak. This formidable structure was built by the Yarubids, a dynasty that ruled Oman in the 17th and early 18th centuries, renowned for their efforts to expel Portuguese colonial forces and consolidate power across the region. The Yarubids left behind grand forts that became symbols of strength and resistance.
The fort at Hazm is the noblest monument I have seen in southeast Arabia. It dates from the last of the Ya Araba Imams, and it shares with Bir Ain and Nazwa the reputation of being one of the 3 finest forts in Oman. A truly magnificent building it is, which for strength and size leave the Portuguese efforts at Muscat a long way behind.
As Bertram Thomas traveled deeper into Oman, his encounters with the diverse social strata of the region revealed the complex fabric of Omani society. Among the most marginalized groups were the Zoot, a wandering caste viewed with disdain by the broader population.
The Zatut are a curious gypsy caste, the most despised race in Oman. Of obscure origin, they rank lower even than slaves. They may not marry or give in marriage outside themselves. Prolonged halting on their part is obnoxious to tribesmen, who invite them to pass on. Thus, they are doomed to wander. They have one distinguishing occupation, circumcising. It is curious that though it is a religious custom that requires the Omani boy of 6 years and the Omani girl of 10 to be circumcised, the performance of the rite is a menial task which no one will undertake, save the Zuti man or woman respectively.
Arriving in Diyan, Bertram Thomas was greeted by a local sheikh. As they settled into the village, Thomas was reminded of the unique pressures that Arab sheikhs faced in their communities.
The Arab chief has scarcely any privacy. There are no set workaday hours for him when his men may seek justice as in a court of law. He is the victim of his high calling, and whether he walks in the morning, noon or night, or is a guest at a meal, so long as he is visible and abroad, men have a right to demand his ear.
One such moment occurred when a slave, humbly kneeling before the assembly, petitioned for unpaid blood money. The slave claimed that after being wronged by one of the sheikh's men, he had received a favorable ruling from a judge, yet his compensation remained unpaid. The tension was palpable as the case was brought before the Sultan, who listened carefully to the complaint and consulted the gathered locals about the judge's reputation for fairness.
Crime is theoretically punishable by an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, though in practice this is seldom carried out. The Sultan, it is true, has before now cut a thief's hand off. The offending hand and the judgments of the Wahhabi Sultan bin Saud, one understands, are habitually governed by the same precept. But for murder, the supreme penalty demanded by this law is in Oman seldom imposed by Sharia authority, though it may well come, indirectly, as a result of a blood vendetta. Sharia usage has come to sanction instead the payment of blood money, and this varies with localities, sects, and qadis.
As Thomas journeyed through Oman, he became increasingly aware of the delicate interplay between tradition and survival. Arab mariners, known for their bold voyages to distant shores, relied on simple tools and their ancestral knowledge to navigate the dangerous waters of the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and beyond.
Medieval-looking Arab craft in the roads, flying the flaming red flag of Muscat, made the noonday scene gay and pageant-like, but when night came, the sea showed not a single riding light. This casualness among Arab mariners, who in other ways are skillful and bold sailormen, voyaging to Malabar, East Africa, and the Red Sea with no aids save a rickety compass, the starry heavens and their own developed instincts, extends to dispensing with headlights and sidelights at sea, and is a constant cause of anxiety to our own merchantmen navigating these waters.
Yet just as Oman's mariners defied the sea with little more than instinct and tradition, its inland tribes navigated an equally complex landscape of conflict and alliances. The arrival of Sheikh Ghusn of the Bani Umar tribe signaled the resurfacing of an old feud with the Hawasina, two tribes locked in a cycle of violence. The Sultan's role as mediator was crucial to restoring a temporary peace, but both he and Thomas knew that such truces were often fragile.
"There is no difficulty about peacemaking here now," His Highness said to me. "Both sides are thoroughly tired after 2 months of mutual fear and bloodshed. Both are in peaceful mode, but as the night follows the day, within a year or two, perhaps before, the fires of hate will be rekindled by some unthinking hothead of one or other of 2 tribes."
These conflicts were not isolated but part of a deeper historical divide. Oman's tribes have long been split between 2 major factions, the Ghafari and the Hinawi. The Ghafari, typically representing northern and central tribes, had roots in ancient Arabian alliances, often aligned with the harsher, more nomadic Bedouin lifestyle. The Hinawi, drawing from southern and eastern Oman, represented a more settled agricultural culture. These 2 factions often fought for dominance, a rivalry that had persisted for generations. By now, Thomas had moved into northern Oman's rugged interior. He found himself on a path seldom traveled by outsiders, and as he made his way deeper inland, it became clear this would not be an easy crossing. Early on, Thomas was handed a letter by a local sheikh, a warning from a crucial coast chief. Though couched in polite terms, the letter hinted at the distrust and hostility awaiting him. As Thomas pressed forward, he encountered nomadic tribes who, while hospitable in some cases, could also be unpredictable. Their adherence to a strict code of survival and honor meant that travelers had to be wary.
The Bedou, faced with a stranger's arrival unheralded, is often well disposed, for is not the fait accompli indeed the will of God? But for the traveller to depend upon this bouncing method of progression is by no means safe. One has to remember that the Bedou conceives himself to have a perfect right to put a bullet through one, capture one's camels, and, with the easiest conscience in the world, ascribe that, too, to the will of God.
Among the tribes Thomas traveled with were the Bani Ka'ab. A year before, he had secured their loyalty to the state, yet their recent history of raids and lawlessness still loomed large in his mind. These were men accustomed to violence and survival at the edges of society, their past actions revealing a volatile nature.
Was it not the Bani Ka'ab, indeed, whose precarious attachment to the state I had secured but a year before, when, their activities culminating with raids on the town of Shinas, they had carried off 2 slaves, sold them on the Pearl Coast, and, as if that was not enough, had returned to paint the place red by setting fire to the garden fences of those they wished further to intimidate.
As Bertram Thomas and his companions traveled deeper into Oman, the peaceful pastoral scene they encountered stood in stark contrast to the region's turbulent history, where the land had witnessed countless battles between invading forces.
Who would imagine, then, that here was a battlefield of all the ages? Yet it had known the tramp of Persian armies and flashed with the glint of their spears and bows and arrows. It had resounded half a millennium later to the triumphant shouts of the fanatical devotees of the new faith, and again, only 100 years ago, to Wahhabi hordes come to spread their light at the point of the lance.
The journey also brought Thomas to Hara Husn, an ancient hilltop fort believed by some to have been an ancient Persian settlement. Yet, as he examined the ruins, Thomas found them to be modest compared to the grand Persian structures he had seen elsewhere, casting doubt on the local traditions.
If this was the capital of the Persian viceroys in the centuries before Islam, as has been suggested by Colonel Miles on the strength of local tradition, Jamshid was as nothing beside those noble memorials left by the Persians of the same centuries which I remember at Uqaydir, in the desert to the west of Najaf in the middle Euphrates, and at Shita in Moab across the Jordan.
These ruins, though sparse, were a silent testament to the complex history of the region, where the traces of Persian, Jewish, and early Islamic influences could still be felt. Arriving in a village, Thomas found the local sheikhs eager to speak with him. However, they were acting under orders from the Naim Sheikh of Baremi to impede his progress, creating a delicate political standoff.
Hayil, one of these hill villages, was greatly excited by our coming. Its sheikhs sought an interview at once, but it was late and I was too tired. On the morrow there was a hurried conference between them and the sheikhs of my escort, for Hayil had received instructions from the Naim Sheikh of Baremi to impede us.
Thomas pressed on despite these obstacles, but there, his own escort refused to continue, fearing the wrath of the Naim without a formal invitation. The region was now a dangerous political battleground, with loyalties divided and tensions high.
Here I was obliged to camp, for my own Arabs declined to proceed into the habitat of the Naim unless or until the latter sent a satisfactory invitation.
Further complications arose when a letter from Baremi revealed that the territory was claimed by Ibn Saud, whose Central Arabian Wahhabi state cast a long shadow over the region, with local leaders warning Thomas of the dangers that lay ahead. Rumors of a Wahhabi mission and the presence of Ibn Saud's tax collectors spread quickly through Thomas's camp, unsettling his escort. The political landscape was shifting, with tribes now paying tribute to the growing power of Ibn Saud, a testament to the turbulent times in Oman.
My camp was in a ferment. The returned escort from Baremi had lost no time in imparting to their fellow Bedouin an alarmist version of their hostile reception, of the arrival of a mission from Wahhabi Najd, and of a war-charged atmosphere. They saw blood.
Despite these challenges, Thomas refused to turn back. He reached the mountain village of Kitna, where the people lived simply, and his interactions with the locals offered a glimpse into the culture of the region.
Here, veiled women, unlike their sisters in the Baatinah, were not disinclined to talk to one, and the children, unfrightened, came prying into one's tent. Only the little girls were shy, delightfully attractive creatures with their olive skins, big almond-shaped eyes, and mop of black bushy hair that was bobbed but for a row of tiny plaits at the back of the head.
In Kitna, hospitality remained a cornerstone of social interaction, but it was not measured by extravagant feasts. Instead, a simple cup of coffee, passed with care and ceremony, signified honor and respect, a tradition not to be overlooked by those unfamiliar with local customs.
Should a hungry Bedou arrive, let him be greeted, a few dates passed to him and the coffee cup, and he will regard his treatment as honorable. Kill the fatted calf instead, and give him rice, the richest food in his imagination, and at the same time withhold the coffee cup, and he will regard it as an affront.
As Bertram Thomas ventured deeper into interior Oman, he encountered a complex web of superstition and custom that shaped the lives of the tribes. At a simple camp, the act of spilling water before drinking, a ritual whose origin was unknown even to those who practiced it, seemed to hint at an ancient, forgotten belief.
Superstition is rife. Men sometimes attribute their sickness to a visit to some jinni-haunted place, whereupon, if they would mend, an old lady or a virgin must go to the spot and place some offering there, a chicken, perhaps, or flour, an egg, and a little fire often sprinkled with incense.
As Thomas and his party traveled through the desert, they encountered the dangers of the wild. The region was home to a variety of animals, but it was the panther that most impressed him.
The panther's guile is interesting. He climbs the jungle trees and lies in wait upon their upper branches for the half-light of dawn, when the camel, with her long neck upstretched to the most succulent fodder at the top, becomes an easy victim. Suddenly, he springs at her head, brings her heavily down, and makes short work of her.
Upon reaching the oasis of Mahada, Thomas was greeted with a lively display of tribal unity and martial pride. The villagers performed their traditional sword dance, an exuberant display accompanied by the steady rhythm of drums.
All the villagers, armed to the teeth with rifles, swords, daggers, and flags, ranged themselves into two facing lines. Then, to the rhythmical roll of the drums, one line advances, the other retiring to conform, blades are brandished, and loaded rifles thrown in the air, caught again, and fired.
The political history of the region also came into focus. Thomas learned about the long-standing tensions between the local tribes and the Central Arabian Najdis, whose influence had ebbed and flowed over more than a century. Though the Najdi threat had diminished, its shadow still lingered over the northern half of Dahira.
Jau, as the northern half of the Dahira is called, has lived under an intermittent menace for 120 years and more, though since the local tribes have come to be armed with rifles, no Najdian invasion has been attempted, but instead only an occasional visit of late years by the tentative tax collector.
The Sheikh recounted the turbulent history of the region, sharing stories of the Najdi conquests that once dominated Oman. These invasions, which brought even the great Sultan of Muscat to his knees, left a deep imprint on the collective memory of the tribes, shaping their resistance and determination to remain independent.
The people of the West, said the Sheikh, Najdis are invariably thus referred to in Oman. First came 4 generations ago. The desert port of the Bedouin succumbed to 700 of their horsemen, and this brought the Bani Yas of Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Naim of Bahraini promptly to their knees. 10 years later, the great Sultan, Saeed bin Sultan of Muscat, had capitulated to them, and Oman was paying $45,000 in yearly tribute. But the Egyptian invasion of Najd from the Red Sea under Muhammad Ali brought respite for 40 years.
As Bertram Thomas and his party descended from the heights, they embarked on the final leg of their journey, crossing the barren stretch of desert, known as Ar-Rami, which formed part of the vast empty quarter. Finally, in the distance, their destination came into view.
The lanky towers of Sharjah, edging the low skyline now in sight, looked like lighthouses on the rim of the sea.
Approaching the town of Sharjah, Thomas was greeted with the remnants of a violent feud. The town had just endured the aftermath of a brutal power struggle between rival sheikhs. The scars of this conflict were still fresh, a reminder of the harsh realities of desert life, where disputes were often settled in blood.
An ex-sheikh of Sharjah had abortively attacked his successor in office. The latter had celebrated his success by drawing red-hot needles across the eyes of 6 hapless prisoners, an operation which killed one and blinded the rest for life.
The journey from Muscat to Sharjah had taken 22 days, providing Bertram Thomas with invaluable first-hand knowledge of Oman's geography and tribal dynamics, insights that would later prove essential in his role as the Sultan's finance minister. Yet, this remarkable expedition was merely a stepping stone in his greater career as an explorer. In 1930, Thomas would face an even more daunting challenge, one that would forever cement his place in history. He ventured into the vast, unforgiving sands of the Rub al-Khali, the Empty Quarter, becoming the first European to successfully cross this immense desert, a feat many had deemed impossible.